Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Mom series, The Misunderstanding of Multiplicity. My name is Maria. Okay. I'm going to be changing the channel name out here, so I wanted to mention that. When I first came out here, my name of my channel was Sensory Overload. And then when Google synced and everything happened, and Blogger and all these things, it took a blogger name that I had with mosaics in it. And I was typing in different usernames to try to get it to accept it. And at some point I typed in awesome and then Astrid for Astrid. And it said okay, so I just went with it. But then I realized I could go with my own name. So I'd like to change it to my own name and see if I can get it fixed. So I'm going to see what's involved in doing that if I don't, if I have to unsync everything and sync it all back or what. Because I'm not the most tech savvy person. But I promised for DID awareness in March, I would read from the book, The Myth of Sanity by Dr. Stout. So I want to read the opening chapter, which describes disassociation, I think, beautifully. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a lengthy chapter, but I want to begin with chapter 1, Old Souls. Old Souls. How does one kill fear? I wonder. How do you shoot a specter through the heart, slash off its spectral head, take it by the spectral throat? I'll leave the rest of that to your imagination. By Joseph Conrad. How do you do that? We are all a little crazy. Now, this is not a original thought. I've heard many over the years, therapists, coworkers, colleagues, people that are in therapy, describe their crazy as a little crazy, like being a little pregnant, I guess. Like, it's manageable. It's just sometimes I feel a little crazy. Okay. So we are all a little crazy, is what Dr. Stout is saying. Remember, this is the myth of sanity, meaning we don't know what sane really is, and we don't know what insane really is. We really don't. And if we study psychology and psychiatry and counseling and social work, one of the first things we learn is nobody knows what normal is. And we're all guessing at what is abnormal. Usually what is abnormal is what bothers you or me or someone else to a degree that makes life unbearable for people to function. So add to it what you will. Anger, impulsivity, swearing, hitting, abusing, shopping too much, spending too much, being a little bit of a perfectionist too much, OCD, too much activity, not enough, depressed, can't get nothing done, sloppy, lazy, whatever you want to call it. Too much, not enough, bothers me and someone else. That becomes disordered and dysfunctional. Okay. In listening to my patients tell me thousands of stories about the past, as they try to find some peace in the present, I have learned this beyond the shadow of a doubt. We are all a little crazy. Rather than behaving sanely, rather than being in touch with our present realities, we human beings, all of us, myself included, are too often simply run by losses, hardships long gone by, and by our stockpiled fears. Our collective history, our individual lives, our very minds bear unmistakable testimony. I've said in other videos, we are walking testimony. Don't have to go get a testimony. Our lives are our testimonies. Okay. Instead of receding harmlessly into the past, the darkest, most frightening events of our childhood and adolescence, and harmlessly into the past, the darkest, most frightening events of childhood and adolescence gain power and authority as we grow older. The memory of these events causes us to depart from ourselves. Let me say that again. The memory of these events. So we do remember. We remember our traumatic, painful, dark, frightening moments of childhood and adolescence. And as all that memory gains power over us, as we grow older, we depart from ourselves. The memory of these events causes us to depart from ourselves, psychologically speaking, or to separate one part of our awareness from others. What we conceive as an unbroken thread of consciousness is instead quite often a train of discontinuous fragments. Our awareness is divided, and much more commonly than we know, even our personalities are fragmented, disorganized team efforts trying to cope with the past, rather than the same unified wholes we anticipate in ourselves and in other people. So it's not just us, other people are this way too. Kind of a normal experience. Is this our unalterable destiny as human beings? Or are there some authentic solutions? In my capacity as a therapist for trauma survivors, I have spent 20 years listening to people's stories, to the recounting of experiences so nightmarish, so abusive, so abhorrent that one might well wish never to have known about them. Then it has been my privilege to know these same people as they recovered from their past experiences and learned how to live in the present. And I believe that their stories contain meaningful lessons in how to leave behind some of our long ago terrors. There are possible solutions that come as gifts to the rest of us from the old soul, the exceptional survivors. I began my practice by specializing in the treatment of people suffering from medical threatening anorexia and intractable depressive disorders. Also, for better or not, I developed a professional reputation as someone willing to take on individuals who were on the edge, patients whose potential for suicide or other self-destructive behaviors had placed them at high risk. Gradually, I began to notice that, too consistently to be ignored, most of the people I was treating were survivors of extreme psychological trauma, and that their symptoms tended to match the phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder just as closely as the most traditional diagnoses of post-traumatic stress. Sometimes I think of my life work as overall lessons learned, themes, discoveries, but much more instructively and frequently, I think in terms of the individual human beings whom my profession has brought to me. On a certain level, I feel tied to many of these people with a knot so tight that I readily understand the appeal of notions such as fate or even karma. I believe I was drawn to them for their fire. Honest, purposeful self-examination of a traumatized life creates a heat so exquisite that it burns away the usual appeasements, self-deceptions, and defenses. What is the meaning of this life becomes a very personal question and demands an answer. Some of the people I have known have burned so fiercely they have gone all stop, have quit their jobs, even endured temporary poverty, because in answering these questions was all consuming of their energy, their physical and mental energy. More energy than one can reasonably generate. One that one solitary individual can reasonably generate. There is something electric in the eyes, a little wild. But paradoxically, and yet, I think for all the same reasons, these same people often reveal an irresistible sense of humor, an ironic angle on life that has dispensed with the polite and the guarded, and that tends to get right to the core of things. And so, though it may sound odd, when I am with my patients, I laugh a lot out loud. Many trauma patients are detached and objective. When they speak of extraordinary events, such particulars as failed suicide attempts, that most other people, if they even speak of such matters at all, tend to cushion with lengthy introductions and euphemisms. As I listen to the telling of the personal history, more often than overt symptoms, it is this Faulkner-esque macrame, along with the burning light in their eyes and the cunning humor, that makes me begin to suspect extreme trauma in the individual's history. As a psychologist and as a human being, I am impressed with the irony that these severely traumatized patients, people who have been through living nightmares, people who might blamelessly choose death, often emerge from successful treatment by constructing lives for themselves that are freer than the ordinary lives that Sigmund Freud a century ago labeled everyday misery. They are the true keepers of the faith, and they are the most passionately alive people I know. Or maybe it is more necessity than irony. I have been told more than once by the survivors of trauma that it would be not worth their while to have struggled so much merely to survive. And that is exactly what the rest of us do. We do not choose to die. We do not choose to live. We go on surviving. We do not choose non-existence, nor do we choose complete awareness. We slog on in kind of a foggy cognitive middle land we call sane, where we almost never acknowledge the haze. Over the years, what my trauma patients have taught me is that this compromise with reality and its traumas is simply not sanity at all. It is a form of madness, and it befuddles our existence. We lose parts of our thoughts in the present. We sabotage the closest of relationships and the comfort in those relationships, and we misplace important pieces of ourselves. All of us are exposed to some form of psychological trauma at some point in our lives. And yet most of us are unaware of the misty spaces in our brains left there by traumatic experience, since for the most part, we experience them only indirectly. Seldom do we ponder the traumatic events in our own lives, let alone the frightening hardships and life or death struggles that were the daily lot of people close to us in terms of time, such as our great-grandmothers and grandfathers. This really made me stop for a minute because I was looking at all that Latino families have gone through at the border, and all immigrants went through to come from the old world to a new country, and the hoops they had to jump through and the opportunities they had, but they had to totally, many, lose their families, leave them behind. They would never see them again, leave everything for the new world. And then the whole immigration process and the pathway to citizenship and how it used to be and how it is now. And now even looking at another country invading another country, what's going on in the Ukraine, and what these children and mothers and elderly and just men are going through. Just life gone, just start over. And then how hard it is for them to assimilate and get back on track, okay? So human beings are built with resilience to do this. We really are. We've been doing it forever. But many times we don't consider what our grandparents went through and those coming from other countries, and maybe what kind of fears they had and how that lent itself to the fears our parents had, and maybe the I want to say what they expected from their children to almost be perfect, and living kind of like they might get sent back on the boat any minute. So trying to be perfect citizens, and their homes being perfect, and their children being neat and clean and understanding whatever language they needed to be in the new country. Here it would be English, right? And speaking it and writing it and not using their native tongue and comprehending everything and being modern enough and assimilating, but still holding on to their culture. I don't think we, as maybe second or third generation, sometimes look at our grandparents and great grandparents and see the lineage of how the expectations we might still be living under and maybe even put on our own children are part of that lineage. So that's when I talk about generational stuff, I talk about that's what I mean. Like, it was harder then than it is now. But people are more apt to talk about their traumas now. Everybody's traumatized, right? Everyone is traumatized. Why weren't they then? I mean, this book looks at this in case studies, okay? But we do feel crazy and a little silly when from time to time we cannot remember a simple task we ought to be able to remember. And people say early onset Alzheimer's, and they'll joke, neither morbidly nor quite lightheartedly. And we feel our insanity, and sometimes a near frantic sense of being out of control of our lives in the misunderstandings and rifts in our most cherished relationships, and the same emotionally muddled arguments that go on for years and years. Conflicts that never quite kill the love that we feel, but they never quite end either. The conflicts that never quite kill the love that we feel, but they never quite end either. And as a society, we feel incompetent and stinkingly helpless when we reflect upon the greater than half failure rates of marriages in general. Too many of us walk on eggshells around our life partners, theoretically the very people whom we should know the best. We do this because we are never certain when that lover or that spouse is going to become aggravated or fall silent or fly into a impenetrable rage, something that happens, or it's something we said, and become a distant stranger, somebody we never knew. Or we look at our parents as they're growing older, and seeing that time is running out, we long to be closer to them, to know them as friends. But when we actually try to think about accomplishing this, our thoughts skitter away like frightened deer in a headlight. And in the next moment, our minds are elsewhere, anywhere else. The rising price of gasoline, a memo at work, a spot on the carpet. Many of us find it difficult and sometimes impossible to stay in one quote unquote mode, to be constant and recognizable even to ourselves. One of the most universal examples of this is the experience of returning quote unquote home to one's parents. After a family visit, the commonest revelation, sometimes private, sometimes voiced aloud, is I turn into a different person. I just can't help it. I just do. All of a sudden, I'm 13 again. We are completely grown up and may even consider ourselves to be rather sophisticated. We understand how we ought to act. We know what we want to say to our mothers and fathers. We have plans. But when we get there, we cannot follow through because suddenly we are not there. Needy, out of control children have taken over our bodies and are acting in our stead. And we are helpless to get our real selves back until we're finally home. Perhaps worst of all, as time passes, we often feel that we are growing benumbed, that we lost something. Some element of vitality we used to have is gone. Without talking about this very much with one another, we grow nostalgic for ourselves. For ourselves. We try to remember the exuberance and even the joy we used to feel in things, and we cannot. Mysteriously, and before we realize what is happening, our lives are transfigured from places of imagination and hope into to-do lists. And day after day, just getting through. Often we are able to envision only a long road of exhausting hurdles that leads to somewhere we are no longer at all certain we want to go. Instead of having dreams, we merely protect ourselves. We expand our grief. We expend our brief and precious life forces in the practice of damage control. So instead of living our dreams, we spend our life in damage control. And all because of traumatic events that occurred in the long ago past that ended, italicized, ended in the long ago past, and that in actuality threaten us no longer, not in the present whatsoever. How does this happen? How do childhood and adolescent terrors that should have been gone years ago manage to live on and make us crazy and alienated from ourselves in the present? The answer paradoxically lies in a perfectly normal function of the mind known as dissociation, which is the universal human reaction to extreme fear or pain. In traumatic situations, dissociation mercifully allows us to disconnect emotional content, the feeling part of ourselves, from our conscious awareness. Disconnected from our feelings in this way, we stand a better chance of surviving the ordeal. What I spoke of in the other video, like the car crash, childbirth, whatever's coming up, getting stabbed, whatever, right? Of doing what we have to do, of getting through a critical moment in which our emotions would only be in the way. Disassociation causes a person to view an ongoing traumatic event almost as if they were a spectator. And this separation of emotion from thought and action, the spectator's perspective may well prevent him or her from being utterly overwhelmed on the spot. It's an overload of everything. Sensory overload is what I named my channel for that reason. So that is the reason people disassociate. It's perfectly normal. And it helps us to survive. And we have taken that simple form of a natural event and made it a disorder, because it only becomes a disorder when you continue to disassociate to a perceived threat that is no longer there. And that includes triggers too. If we run around saying this triggers me, that triggers me, it's a perceived threat. So it's very important to face our triggers. So I promised I would read that to you. The first title is Dissociation, and the rest of the book is case studies and what she's learned by working with different people that either self-harm or starve themselves or have depressive disorders that had trauma in their past, like a lot of trauma. We're not talking about one or two events that happen on one or two occasions over the span of a few years or one big event, but trauma is trauma is trauma. So what one person's overload of trauma can be another person's blip on a map. So we can't go around judging people's trauma, saying, well, that wasn't enough trauma to really get you here. But what she really points out is kind of what I used to ask my doctor all the time is, well, how come people in the Holocaust didn't have MPD, DID? How come they didn't have post-traumatic stress to the point of making and creating other people? There were little children there that saw people being stabbed, raped, killed, asphyxiated, choked, beaten. Children of war, how come they don't have other? Well, they experienced it with a whole bunch of people, is how it's always been explained to me, is their trauma was validated by mass trauma. Everyone experienced the same thing. Nobody could say it didn't happen. It was a part of history. So what I'd like to say is, when something happens, when someone is a child, and I want to be clear about this again, the whole Me Too movement that has become something like the panic days of the SRA time during the 80s, 90s, and witch hunts has brought us into a very murky area of having to investigate people's stories and find the validity in it and make them valid. Because usually children will show some kind of behavior in school, at home, going to a house they're abused at, going to a babysitter they're abused at, going to be with a person that makes them feel icky or ashamed or wrong. There will be something then, not later. Okay, so I'm going to keep talking about this repressed, recovered memory stuff, because the actual memories are never repressed. The feelings, the emotional part, is what's repressed in disassociation. So we come into ourselves by beginning to feel that pain. But we always knew what occurred, but we're finally willing to feel it, own it, and let it go. Best we can. Best we can. Okay. So that's why it's imperative that we do allow ourselves to be triggered. Okay, that's my video, and I would suggest this book to anybody that is dealing with dissociative disorders or DID or post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress. The Myth of Sanity by Dr. Martha Stout. Divided Consciousness with the Promise of Awareness. It's a great book. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks.